All right, thank you everybody for attending our webinar. Today we're going to discuss the title being Archives Are Always Essential, which is a topic that all of us I know have been feeling this year and has come up in even more importance with COVID-19 happening, the discussion of what is essential and that disconnect of when we classify things as essential labor, those positions are usually precariously funded, they're underpaid. And so we really wanted to tap into the idea of what is essential, particularly for archives and people who take care of archives, and dig into outreach and such that hasn't worked, and then what we're seeing that we're really excited about. So with that said, I want to introduce us to kick us off. I am Rachael Cristine Woody, owner of Rachael Cristine Consulting, and I am here today doing a co-presentation with Ryan Anthony Donaldson. And thank you so much, Ryan, for joining me on this one.
Absolutely, thank you.
And Ryan, would you like to introduce yourself and hop right into the presentation?
Yes, certainly. So my name's Ryan Anthony Donaldson. Like Rachael, I also have my own consulting business with a focus on archives and working with a number of organizations, both nonprofit and corporate, on heritage and history related initiatives. And really for both Rachael and I to be successful as consultants, we really have focused on effectively communicating the value of archives. We've done that in a variety of ways and through our orientation through proposals and pitches. And so we look forward to being able to share some of that with you today.
Great.
And so in terms of what we're going to cover today in our outline, we're going to start with some context from the Council on Public Awareness, of which Rachael has a leadership position, from some survey work that was done previously. We're then going to talk about some of the Archives Month themes, and in particular, some of the work that's being done here in Washington State. We're then going to discuss some of the historical issues around challenges archivists and those that love archives have had in terms of conveying the value to other stakeholders and audiences. We're then going to launch into some of the specialized and even more intense challenges that have emerged due to us living in 2020 and COVID-19 and that shifted reality. And then we're going to turn things to hopefully a bit more of a positive response and to talk about some actionable, practical types of responses that we believe can be helpful and can aid all of you that are facing these challenges and hopefully inspire. And then we're going to end on some resources that we will be making available as well. And so in terms of some housekeeping, we have a chat box with a Q&A, and we encourage all of your questions and comments. We will be monitoring that throughout the session. And we also want to thank those that have already contributed questions. It's really through your questions that it can help strengthen our presentation and make sure that it meets some of the needs and questions that you may have. And we also want to remind you that there is a full screen option for being able to see the screen in a larger size. And so to do that, to expand to the full screen, look to the bottom right where there is a toolbar, and there is a bracketed square icon that's on the far right. Once you click that, it will then enlarge the screen and thus will be a bit easier to see. And also wanted to point out that on that same toolbar, there is a auto caption. It may not be available for you now, but YouTube will be auto captioning this recording. And so that will be available as well for you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for taking care of that housekeeping for us. This particular slide I want to introduce to you for those who are maybe not as aware. The Council on Public Awareness survey results. This particular survey result came out of COPA, which is the Committee on Public Awareness under the auspices of Society of American Archivists. And for COPA, the main mission is to make sure that we are trying to, more than trying, actively supporting archivists and archives convey their value. So that's like the main mission for COPA, and is one of the things that, as many of you know, I feel very passionate about. And so one of the services that we started exploring this year, mostly in response to needing support around how to do better awareness programs, but also in response to it being COVID and needing to do programming virtually. We gave us webinar earlier this year in April, Driving Value from Collections in the Time of Corona, and got such a great response out of that that we did a survey to figure out what other kinds of programming would be helpful for our colleagues. And what came out of that, one of the top two that were almost like unanimously desired were, the first one, how to create effective programs and activities so thinking about archives and how you're using your collection. And then the second one being how to promote from within. So we're seeing high demand for wanting to know how to do better, both externally and internally. So that, for me, as someone who's very interested in outreach and what that looks like, particularly from promoting from within, I myself was very excited to see that also be reflected in what our colleagues are saying, and that it's so important to convey that archives value statement, both internally and externally. So that is part of what helped inform Ryan and I's discussions and how we sort of landed on this theme for today's webinar.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And in addition to forming the backdrop for our session today, we are recording this session in October 2020, and every October is Archives Month, which is an opportunity for us to be proactive in our outreach efforts and advocacy for the profession and for our collections. And I am a part of a statewide group that is the planning committee for the Washington State Archives Month. There are 3 themes this year that we are exploring. The first is creativity. The second is rights, and the third is resilience. I see all 3 fitting into the responses from those of you that responded to the COPA survey, as well as responses to our current condition, the challenges and needs that we have. So we're looking forward to sharing some of those examples with you shortly, and using these 3 themes as a lens for us to be able to have that discussion.
So diving in, thinking about conveying value, for many of us, that has always been a bit of a struggle, right? And actually was one of the main impetuses for the Committee on Public Awareness to be formed. It's one of the newer committees, if you can believe it. It's only been around, I think, 8 years. And so that really, I think, shows and expresses this sort of universal issue we're all having with how do we even construct that value message? How do we communicate that value message? And what is effective? And as we grapple with this, and as we dig into some more details, I really want you to think about, it's about conveying value, whether that's internally or externally. What we really need to focus on and get better at is, what is the value message and how can I effectively get it out there? So to cover some of the traditional outreach methods, I think is important because we did these previous activities and mechanisms for outreach that were, having so-so results. And then I think it's important to know these as we then look at the COVID challenges on top of that, so that we can really analyze what was working for us or not pre-COVID, and then how that got more difficult, and then really jump into some of the exciting stuff that Ryan's going to share with us later. So to set the stage for us, I broke down like the typical 5 main buckets. When we think about archives and we think about our traditional outreach sort of mechanisms, this is what I came up with. So first one being events, whether it's October's American Archives Month, whether it's hashtag Ask an Archivist Day, open houses, galas, fundraising events, lectures, anything that has the collection as one of the centerpieces that people are coming to see in the context of it being an event. The second one is instruction. So whether you're using the collection for pre-K through 12, whether you're using the instruction to inform curriculum for undergraduate or graduate, thinking about the instruction we do with collections to an audience. The next one down is meetings. So thinking about that internal outreach mechanism, all the meetings that we go to try and raise awareness of the archives and the work that we're doing there. And of course, raise awareness of what our needs are for the archives and how to take care of them. The fourth one then is exhibits. So for those of you that have display cases or do pop-up exhibits or even have designated exhibit space, this is the idea of taking a collection, putting it on display so that people can come and view it. And then the fifth one is print. And this is essentially a catch-all for blog posts, articles, peer-reviewed or not, press releases, any sort of putting into text, putting into print, conversation about the collections and demonstrating and using examples of the collections in a written form. So those are sort of the top 5 main buckets. When we think of our traditional outreach, it's usually been in these mechanisms. So what are the issues with those mechanisms? So even just pre-COVID, many of them had significant limitations. So first one being space and money. So events, exhibit space, etc. If you don't have the space or the money to put those on, then there's limited ability on your part to actually do those types of outreach activities. The next one, of course, is time, knowledge, and energy. So we all are usually pretty full with our workloads, and often, especially if we're down employees, which many of us are now, that you have even less time and more duties. So time is a huge limitation for many of those outreach mechanisms. And the other being knowledge and energy. If you've lost staff, you've lost some of that institutional knowledge. And of course, energy-wise, if you're already overworked, there's not a whole lot extra that you can do in those terms. And unfortunately, outreach for many of us sort of always falls into that extra if I have time category. The next one for limitation is the ability to sustain the activity. So yes, okay, maybe we could do a display or host an event for October's American Archives Month, but that takes a significant amount of your energy and time, and can you even sustain it? So maybe you can do it like once a year, but you can't do it regularly. And then thinking about some of the external issues that we're grappling with, even pre-COVID, is the perception of archives having sort of that elite, you know, behind the ivory gates, the gatekeeping that's perceived, some of it being the nature of the archives, but some of it being an issue on our part of not being able to create a fully welcoming environment. So we're grappling with that, and some of the outreach mechanisms that we've traditionally used, like events and galas, those are not necessarily welcoming to everybody who would be interested in our collections. So we really need to think more about that. And then of course, visitor access and visitor understanding. For a lot of us, the way we're presenting our archives can be a little esoteric for people. And in our traditional roles as archivists, we've usually allowed access to the collections, but haven't really been actively participating in conveying what these collections are and how they could be used. We've sort of been a bit more neutral or behind the scenes. And that has limitations, and it's something that I think we can no longer afford in several senses. So major limitations even pre-COVID. Which gets us into COVID-19 and just 2020 in general, the challenges and complications we're dealing with right now. So top 3, which, you know, I tried to really hone it in because of course there are many things we could talk about here, but mainly it's distance and isolation. It's distance and isolation from us as colleagues and coworkers, and it's distance and isolation between us and our audiences and the communities that we serve. The second one being that we are traumatized. All of us are going through some level of trauma for all of the things that have happened this year. So that's important to think about when, especially us as the collection workers, are trying our best to not only try and take care of the collections, sometimes remotely, but also try and serve our audiences who are also traumatized. So there's some critical thinking we need to do around this in terms of how to take care of ourselves and also make sure that we are being sensitive and empathetic and taking care of our audiences. And then of course, to keep in mind, there is currently no relief in sight, which Ryan and I are really purposefully trying to keep this presentation optimistic and offer actionable things. But I think it is important for us to acknowledge that it has been a long year, and it will likely continue to be a long year until some things hopefully change in the next couple of months. So these are all important things to keep in mind, that in addition to those limitations, we now have these challenges. So I want you to think about needs, and especially as we shift back over to Ryan and start talking about some exciting things, I want you to keep these three needs in mind. The first one is that any outreach mechanism we consider, we need it to be convenient, and we need it to be convenient for ourselves as the collection workers, and we need it to be convenient for our audience, for them to take on board and consume in a way that they want to. The second one, of course, is that it needs to meet a need. So this also goes both ways. As the collection worker, whatever outreach activity I'm doing, I want to make sure that it's meeting a need for me, whether that's for my position, whether that's for the mission of the archives, whatever activities I'm doing, especially since we're so overworked and stressed right now, it has to be checking off a box that meets a need. And conversely, for our audience, we shouldn't just be spamming them with things that aren't thoughtful or intentional. We should be purposefully providing them parts of our collection in a way that meets a need for them as the audience. So whether that is providing them education or providing them enjoyment, just being purposeful about that. And then the last one, of course, which will kick us off into getting into some great examples, is thinking about how to package it. So we've talked about the traditional ways we've packaged those outreach mechanisms and the limitations of that. I want us to get creative and get a little bit more excited about how can we pre-package our collections, knowing the challenges we're facing and knowing the needs we're trying to meet. How can we package those collections for us and our audience in a way that will be helpful and enjoyable and a lot more sustainable?
Great. Well, thank you, Rachel, for setting the scene. I would like to pick up on a few of these points and to really be able to couch it within what we can do. We certainly are in a year that is filled with challenges. We are very much at a point where we're facing challenges to the work we're doing to be able to advocate for that work effectively. We want to focus on three approaches that we believe will be helpful going forward. What are those three approaches? So the first is pivoting, the second is adapting, and the third is flexing. We're not saying that these are distinct activities. In fact, we see ways in which they weave together. However, we want to provide this approach to see each one kind of in its own orbit, and then leave it to you to be thinking creatively about how there might be some of those orbital intersections and things that you could be doing with your own collections that align with these activities. And so if we move into pivoting and reflect on that for a moment, I would like you to consider the basketball pivot. Whether you've played basketball recently or it may be a bit more of a distant memory, such it is for myself, when you're pivoting in basketball, you stay on one leg in the same spot. You're holding the ball, and then you're turning your body, you're turning the radius of your body with your other foot. And you're looking to either pass the ball to a teammate, you're looking to take a shot to try to make a basket. So you have the same goal, but you're really just changing the direction of your delivery. And this can be an uncomfortable feeling. You're taking another direction to get to the same goal. You're literally off balance in a way as you are relying on your vision and your other senses to try to figure out what your next move is, along with having these challenges as the defenders, as the opposing team. The distractions, the way in which you're being prevented from trying to get to the goal that you are looking towards. We also would offer that there are layers of pivots. There's the societal pivot. We're really reflecting on our values now. We're thinking about how we participate in society. We're thinking about how we use our time, the value in which we're putting in our time, whether that's something that we're deciding on ourselves or it's a circumstance that is brought to us. And There's also organizational pivots. Organizations now are really engaged in thinking through core missions and activities and how to be able to meet some of these same goals without having the commonplace kind of strategic goals and strategy that has been done before, that in a lot of cases has been wiped away. So pivoting is really a proactive way to reassess how you're meeting the needs of your community and constituents and audiences.
Mm-hmm.
I'd also like to invite us to think about career pivots, the idea that there can be ways in which we can collaborate with colleagues in other sectors that may not have been available before. And that in some cases, there are those that have pivoted themselves towards archives that had no experience before through the experience of COVID-19, that we could really team up with to be able to get to the result that we're looking for. So one example I'd like to share is it's a local example here in Washington State. It's with the Wenatchee Valley Museum and Cultural Center. In the spring, there was the Common Concerns online series that was done through the Washington State Historical Society. In this session, the staff from the Wenatchee Museum, they presented on how they took all of their programs, all of the traditional types of outreach methods that Rachael outlined, and they went all to video. That included curators' talks, virtual programs that would have been on site, and really their entire calendar had been transformed. We invite you, and we'll go ahead and make this link available to you. They looked to the platforms that were available. They admitted that they really had no experience in doing this kind of work. However, they realized that through this pivot that they were able to get to the goal of being able to have more visibility for the museum, for being able to communicate the importance of their collections. And so they used a variety of no and low cost platforms, including Video Shop, Canva. They have Premiere Pro at a discounted rate by being a nonprofit entity. And they really leverage their efforts for being able to deliver content in a variety of platforms in an efficient way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a scrappy approach. It really involved creativity and the staff's willingness to learn these new tools. So I really applaud the staff for being able to do that. And the outcome being that they've been able to deliver on these initiatives. They've been able to increase their audience, and they've retained and even enhanced their visibility online. As we move forward, pivoting is really about meeting audiences where they are. We can really just talk about the fact that a lot of this is through content being delivered to phones, to devices, and to laptops and computers. One thing that we're seeing is that as a result of the impacts of COVID-19, there are studies that are saying that now the average time that a US consumer spends with media has risen more than an hour in their day, so that now here in 2020, the average amount of time spent is 13 hours and 35 minutes. It is shocking to consider, but also we invite you to think about this as an opportunity where in meeting audiences where they are, how content can be developed and how to look to what are the platforms, the commonly available platforms that people are on today, and also to try to encourage in others to be able to quote from, get screenshots of, be able to leverage what you're putting out there, and then for them to help communicate that message. One Instagram account I'd like to mention briefly is the Instagram account race_women. This is an account that was started by Maya Millett. And Maya actually provided part of the inspiration for the title of our talk today. Back in July, there was a post that was done where she had said that our archives are essential. Maya's background, according to her Twitter bio, is as a storyteller, Brooklyn dweller, Midwest forever, independent writer and editor. She's producing content that involves honoring Black feminist foremothers, as she calls them, through being able to look to collections and then write short bios to then bring about more interest, and then to have those that are interested be able to go to these sites to be able to learn more about the collections. So she's drawn from the Library of Congress, Fisk University's archives, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the University of Chicago's photo archives, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, and even her family's own archives. And another very cool thing that I also really thought was inspiring was for portraits of women of which we don't have photographs, actually having artists do portraits, and then being able to combine that with some of the other documentary evidence that then creates these biographies. So that's the first of the three approaches. And then we'd like to move into adapting. So what do we mean by adapting? Really what we're talking about here is that adapting is a response to changing environmental conditions. COVID-19, of course, is that huge environmental condition that has now changed so much of what we do. It's also one where it has a similar layered approach. Society as a whole is trying to adapt. Individual organizations are trying to adapt. And one thing I'd like us all to think about is other industries that are trying to adapt and how we might look for best practices or inspiration. Let's think about the travel and hospitality industry. They have faced widespread loss, widespread confusion over where the future is headed. Flights being canceled, hotels not being open, all of these traditional methods of operating the business now being completely challenged. One example that I had seen that I found very interesting was with a group out of Tacoma, Washington called Pretty Gritty Tours. All of the tours leading up to most recently have been in person. You know, you would meet the guide, you would then go through either the historic waterfront site, go on an architectural tour, and then you would hear these insights in person, be able to ask your questions. Much like the Wenatchee Museum Group, they've now gone online with virtual tours. As we share these links, and you feel free to check these out on your own time, they've imagined it as an interactive experience. One quick example is with a virtual kayak tour of Tacoma's waterfront, where historic sites are mentioned. They talk about the overall history. Pretty Gritty Tours actually filmed on the kayak showing some of these locations and actually made an experiential tour online where if you looked closely enough, you actually had that sense of being along on the tour, which really increased the engagement. Also think of other service industries. Also, let's think about healthcare and the rise of telehealth services. One thing that we're seeing now amongst some of our colleagues is offering virtual reference, offering virtual tours of the archives that allow visitors to be safe and healthy. And I think there's a lot more we could look to from the healthcare industry on how they've been able to do those things with telehealth. And also let's think about the artist community. One example that we'd like to share is with a New York City artist, Jocelyn Aram. And she is an artist who specializes on turning archival content into art. Earlier this year, she actually developed an online course for artists to learn more about how to do this. And one quote that she made I found very compelling is saying that as we face geographic and financial challenges to creating new content, archival content is a medium many artists and organizations can already turn to because it allows us to maximize existing resources. And so this really touches on what Rachel's mentioning before. It's for us to consider what are other audiences that can take our content and really run with it for what we've already digitized, for what we already have available online, that for them is a whole new layer of discovery, and that they can share that and carry our message forward as to the overall value of these collections. And, you know, really the idea being to consider the fact that we are all in this together, that the archives industry has been deeply impacted, but also other industries have as well. So let's think about how we can possibly team up in ways we never, would have ever thought about before. And also when we think about adapting, I also just want to take a quick minute to talk about a note on self-care. Rachael had talked about the importance of taking care of ourselves. And really, with the perceived value of archival labor being diminished, with a lot of resources being denied, it's very important to think about how we adapt through some form of self-care. To think that we can continue as we have been with our work practices, to think about the fact that we'll just go head down and just kind of jump into things. That's really an approach that I'd like us all to be thinking more about. Previously, with the deriving value webinar that was done before, some of these practices and tips and tricks were addressed with Rachael and with Margot Note and with Chris Cummings. And I picked up a few of these myself. And so one is really finding ways to more effectively manage my time. There are different online tools and tools based within browsers to help with that. So one that's really helped me is the Pomodoro method, where for about 25 minutes, I'm really locked into engaging and trying to move forward with a task, even if it seems overwhelming, even if I'm allowing some of these other factors to kind of enter into my mind. And what's great is within the browser, it will keep the time for you. It will give a warning when the time is coming closer. And then following that period of time, you have a short break. So it's been a very nice way to kind of frame my time and to try to be productive in this environment. And also another aspect as well to start my day is to have some form of commute, even if it's a bit of the act of having the commute and returning to my home/office. So one strategy I've had is to walk around the block just to get some fresh air, just to have that chance of being outside, and then to mentally refresh myself. So when I do come back home, to be able to really dive in and to get some work done. I'm also very fortunate to be able to access a co-working space, which has also helped me as well to be able to have that focus in having that opportunity to be in another space. So then the final of the three types of actions that we're discussing is flexing. And really what we mean by that is, to think about this historical problem that we've had with conveying value, and to think this is the time to address it. This is the time to flex our expertise. This is the time to really consider how we can create really engaging digital experiences that go far beyond what we've been able to do in person before, far beyond what we've been able to do with a small audience in the stacks of our collections. And then to even consider hybrid approaches, the fact that for some of us, we have limited access to our archives and the public doesn't. So when we're there, how we could film videos, how we could show collections that we have minimally described, how we could actually increase our access to a global audience in ways that we've never been able to do before. Because really the reality is that we're battling for screen time. Most videos are not watched past 8 seconds. There's so many other types of distractions that can get in the way. This flexing is really about how we can demonstrate our expertise, how we can leverage these platforms to be able to make these statements. And for Rachael and I, being in a world of making pitches and proposals, to really boil down or be able to essentialize, what some of these important points are, to capture that attention, to be able to then bring more interest. And I'd like to end on one example that I have found very inspiring, that I see takes this flexing approach and also incorporates the other types of actions we're discussing. And this is an example with Dave Moore. Dave Moore is the Heritage and Digital Asset Manager for Carhartt. Dave, over the years, has worked with multiple teams to create brand heritage displays in selected retail locations for the store. I've had a chance to see them in a few cities, including here in Seattle, and they're really quite wonderful. They create and cultivate the brand awareness. So due to COVID-19, there were widespread closures that continue to impact the ability for Dave to deliver on having audiences be able to see some of this content in person. One thing that he stuck with is, how does he communicate the brand story? How does he make the archives relevant for a company that is facing a lot of challenges being in the retail apparel industry now, to be able to generate revenue, to be able to meet some of these essential objectives? Dave actually found some heritage content in the collection, and he worked with designers to repackage some of it. And one campaign that just has been released recently is the Heritage Camo Collection. It is a variation on Carhartt's first camouflage pattern design, which was originally done in 1972. And so Dave worked with the archive team to acquire a vintage camo jacket, and then they scanned it at very high resolution in sections, and they worked to stitch it together. They then took these scans and brought them to the product design team. They then worked collaboratively to create a new pattern that is now part of a limited edition collection that from initial reports has been doing remarkably well. This collection is available online, and Dave has actually been able to do some press around it as well. And so, we'll be sure to share those links and to see Dave's flexing to be able to discuss the importance of the collection and use that entryway of this new line that draws upon the company's heritage is really, I think, a great example for us to look to together. As we move forward, being able to say that our expertise as archivists is our asset. And whether we have it on a local level, meaning that we have a level of local knowledge that we can share, whether that we have a subject knowledge that we can then be able to broadcast out and share and inspire others, that's really the purpose. So we really invite you to think about the fact that you have a level of expertise that very few others have. You have an opportunity to communicate that internally within your organization, and also through some of these publishing online to inspire others to carry that brand forward and to bring that to audiences that you may or may not yourself have any awareness of. And so we just, again, invite you to think about the fact that the online space is really an active performative space. When you're creating some of this content, you're wearing multiple hats, and one is really a content creator, that you're taking these archives, you're taking these collections, and you're bringing them to life, much like Dave did working with a team. The enthusiasm, the energy that you show, that's really a part of what you're conveying overall. That you have to think through, for someone to go to another browser tab, what are ways of being able to get that message across and to be able to do it in a short amount of time. Not to belabor the point, but that expertise is your asset. That's part of the value that you're bringing in. Whether you are at a local historical society, whether you're part of a museum archive, whether you are a corporate archivist, whether you are with a university, or like Rachael and myself, you are working independently, what unites us all is having that level of being able to see these collections, understand some of that inherent value, and then being able to communicate and share that online.
And I would just love to chime in, Ryan, because I think this is such a critical point, is, thinking about, say, a couple of years ago, there was an imposter syndrome session that was wildly popular because we all apparently have sort of a proclivity to downplay or not quite realize the assets that we bring as collection workers. And so I really want to make sure that people are aware of that, and that, now is not the time to operate how we did. Like, that wasn't working for us at the time, and it's especially not working for us now during COVID. So for you, the person who's worked with the collection, you have seen more of that collection than probably anybody else. And therefore, your knowledge of the collection, the possibilities and opportunities it holds, the ties and connections that could be made, that's on you. Like, you are literally the only person who has that breadth of knowledge that could then make these connections and put these collections in the hands of people who could do some really great things. So I just wanted to super highlight this point, because we can't continue to operate how we've been. We need to start behaving as the experts that we are.
Rachael, I really appreciated hearing that. I think it does tie in quite well. And, just to kind of, finish on this point before we dive into a few questions, is that not only are we facing the reality of COVID-19, also as a society, we also are coming to terms with many racial justice issues that are occurring. And so part of this flexing is to look to the collections and what has been unprocessed, what has been neglected, what has been
Yeah.
forgotten, and
Hmm.
then to bring that into some of today's conversations. So we're really at a unique time for that. I know that there are a few groups, including Princeton University, that is engaged with what are inclusive descriptive practices that we can do to be able to daylight some of this and to be able to tell some of these stories. So
Hmm.
that's another piece to consider, is
Hmm.
that not only do we have the professional expertise, we have the subject expertise, but we can also grow ourselves and learn more about our own collections to then be able to bring that to bear on these larger conversations.
Hmm. And to signal boost, there's two groups I want to make sure, and we'll drop links for them, is We Here, which helps with professional development for librarians and archivists. And also, I think it's the Black Archivists Collective, and a group of our colleagues who are Black colleagues and who are doing some great work there. So we'll drop those links so that all of you have access to the great work that they're doing. So Ryan, we've made it to the question portion. We had a few submitted questions that we wanted to make sure that we touched on. Time-wise, we're doing pretty good. We have at least 15 minutes to go through these and wrap up. So first question for us, do you have suggestions for making a business case for archives in a corporate setting? And Ryan, as a mostly corporate archivist, I would allow you to go first.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. In terms of my background, just to kind of set the stage a little bit, I worked for over 10 years for the Durst Organization, a real estate company based in New York City with approximately 15 million square feet in residential and commercial space. And so one of the things that was really incredible about this opportunity was being able to build a corporate archives program. One thing that I found very effective to the point of this question and through my own experience is, if the archives can be aligned in any way with marketing initiatives, if it can be aligned in any way with core business activities.
Mhm.
So what happened at Durst was that in 2015, there was the 100-year centennial anniversary for the company. I realized that for some of you out in the audience, there's this realization that in some cases that will start an archive, as having a milestone date and then being able to go back and to try to find resources to support that.
Mhm.
So this was a case where the anniversary was coming up. I worked with a cross-functional team within the company to start to think through what we're going to do. And really, the idea is that, sure, it's great that there's an anniversary for the company, and 100 years in a real estate market, is very impressive. However, we really used it as a jumping off point to announce the company pivoting strongly into the residential market, and to actually pivot the introduction of a whole new development project, and to utilize the centennial through the centennial publication. And we had an exhibition as well to announce that, and then to actually talk about the history of that area that then led up to the present day site and the community building and the work that Durst was doing in the community to be able to address the community needs and then to be able to develop the site. So to this question, I would ultimately say, wherever you are positioned within the organization, or even if you are a consultant,
Mhm.
really look to what is ahead for the company and how the archives can be a part of that in some way, and to really look to how it can be creative, and really to be thinking of what we were discussing before, and to get outside of your comfort zone as well. The idea that it's okay to say, I don't know all the aspects of this history, but I'm bringing it forth to have this be a part of the conversation.
I love that. I helped establish the Organ Wine History Archive, which of course is business inclined. And the phrase that I found that really sort of sparked understanding for the non-archivists in the room was legacy curation, which isn't necessarily an archivist term, but they get the idea that their business has a legacy and that that has marketable value. And so just to add a 2 cents here is that phrase is a good one. I invite you to use it and to think about, in addition to those anniversaries and things you could tap into that have interest around them, even thinking about outside the company or outside your archives, whether it's corporate or not. You know, thinking this year, like it was the ratification of the 19th Amendment was this year is a big one, and how your organization or your company could at least speak to these hallmarks throughout the year. Those are always of interest. So again, thinking creatively and how you can tie what you have in the collection to something that is happening currently. Excellent. Next question. What language should I use to convincingly convey the value of the collections? Which is a very simple question, but also very, like, probably very long, complicated, very important things to think about. Would you like me to go first, Ryan, or do you have some immediate thoughts you want to share?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. So the legacy curation piece, depending on what setting you're in, and I always encourage people, whether it's talking about value or in my grant writing strategy, when I teach those courses, it's to use general language. As experts and essentially subject matter experts, it's so easy for us to fall into a very comfortable but very technical language, which has almost no meaning to people who are not in the archives. So really work on generalizing your language when you're communicating external to the archives, whether it's internal in the organization or abroad. But really thinking about general language and really thinking about what is it that is of value that matters to that person. And so it's going to be different depending on who that person is, but really thinking strategically in terms of who is that person, what is their job, what would they care about in terms of my collection. There's a webinar I would invite you to go look at, which is strategies for how to capture and communicate the value of collections. It'll be tagged in this video and I'll drop the link as well, but I spend a whole hour talking about strategy for how to capture and communicate value. So you can definitely get a whole hour's worth of more tips from there.
Well, thank you, Rachel. I think that's a great response. I would completely echo the use of general language. I understand that in the industry, we have a really an incredible level of technical knowledge. A lot of us going to grad school, taking additional courses outside of our day jobs, to be able to get a technical grounding and to be able to understand how products and platforms work and digital asset management systems and content management systems. But ultimately, it is that general language that will carry the day through. It's being able to take complex kinds of projects and ideas and be able to boil it down where it is understood by a variety of audiences, and to really try to avoid a scenario where you are talking to a stakeholder and you allow for confusion, or you use a word, an industry term that they not may be familiar with, because that puts them on their own pivot. That makes them uncomfortable. It can make them uncomfortable. Just be thinking maybe a bit more through an empathetic lens or a bit of grace, to be thinking, we're in, whether it's a one-on-one conversation, whether it's a larger meeting, how can I convey this? And then get to a point where they'll ask for more details, or they're looking for more complexity, rather than introduce the complexity first and then have this possible confusion. There's also the language of numbers. There's also the language of metrics. And so I think that can also cut through some of this as well to be compelling. So as we're talking about things moving online, page clicks, views, those are things that can go across multiple audiences. So not only is it something that within your team could be part of it, let's take a look to see the level of engagement that we get. But then when you report up as well, those are things that will definitely help make a difference. And then I would also offer to sprinkle in a few qualitative types of responses too. Someone who really benefited from the use of your archive, and to combine those together for conveying the value of the collections.
Yes. just to re-emphasize the great point you raised, Ryan, about how the language can be off-putting and make that person uncomfortable, which is obviously not our goal. Just re-emphasizing that that's part of what I meant by elitism / perceived gatekeeping, is the language that we use can be intimidating. The white gloves we put on can be intimidating. And so really thinking about the words we use and the presence that we have, because I think in every case, it's fair to say that we want people to feel welcome in the archives. So we need to adjust and modify accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Next question. Do you have suggestions for expressing why a dedicated space for archival work is necessary? I definitely have some thoughts, but would you like to start this one?
Sure. So, I think this is a terrific question. I think it's perennially a terrific question. Through my career, I've encountered this in a number of different scenarios. I think it's fair to say that, Rachael, you have too, because part of what it comes down to is to be able to have a dedicated archival space requires a lot of money and resources. To be able to have a climate-controlled space, when it's discussed with those that may not have the same background or the same understanding, can be viewed as a loss leader, can be viewed as we're just kind of throwing our money away. What is the point? One way that I try to talk about it is the fact that having these items that are hundreds of years old, the fact that they're very fragile and we still have them, being able to have this dedicated space is a way to further that investment. It really is. It's a way to try to maximize what multiple hands and minds have been working with for a while. Or to take a different approach, we are benefiting from that neglect. We're benefiting from the fact that these are items that were put away. In my career, I've encountered, archival items in floorboards, in various places that made me cringe at the time, but also taking that step back to be grateful for the fact that that was done, and the neglect can lead to the preservation. Now, approaching the question from a bit of a different angle, one thing I've seen that has been successful, especially now being where we are today, especially now thinking about the health and safety, is really considering ways in which there can be some flexibility for the space to be used in multiple ways, how there can be some alignment with perhaps the facilities teams or those managing the building, be able to come to some understanding of meeting some, maybe not all of the archival requirements, but still being able to get that support that you need, and really looking at it as your baseline in managing these collections. What's the minimum? What is the minimum that I can offer for all my collections? Or, and we've seen this in a few instances as well, is to kind of have a tier A and tier B for your collection. These are the high value items. This is really, these are the items that are most fragile. And I'm going to develop another plan for how to ensure that these tier A items are going to be preserved for the long term. And then to say there's another level of care, not to say that these are unimportant items, but to try to prioritize. Because we also are facing, as an industry, the fact that we are now at a point of reassessing so much material. We are at a point now of having to kind of come to grips with the fact that some of this material that was collected, we may not know a lot about. It may have its own preservation issues. So that reassessment is also an opportunity to think more about this question.
Excellent points and great foundation there. I think what I would add is referencing best practices, because for many of us in the situations we're in, again, you are the expert in this. And so it could be that your boss honestly just doesn't realize what is best practices for collections. Also the language of money or numbers, as Ryan emphasized in a previous point. I have had to do this before. And so I calculated that the area they had given me where I could work, it took me 30 minutes to grab the boxes that I was working on, put them on a cart, move them to that room, unpack the folders that I was working on. And then you have to do that all in the reverse, right? Because I wasn't allowed to stay in that room forever. So talking about how, it's an hour of my day just to move the collection back and forth, which is, time is money. Security also, just the fact that if you're having to set it up somewhere that is not secure, like you can't go to the bathroom, you can't take a lunch, you then have to pack things up. So really emphasizing the challenges involved by them having you go somewhere that's not ideal. Um, and then I would encourage you as a strategy, if you still need to convince people for a better solution, is to you've come with some of those solutions to your boss or whoever the decision maker is, and then invite them to help you solve it. So if they're saying, oh, well, you know, Rachel, you could just work on the collections in the lunchroom when people are eating lunch. And so I could say, well, okay, boss, that is an idea. Here are some of the challenges slash costs around that. How would you have me solve for that? And maybe it's a compromise of you can use the executive conference room every Monday. Maybe that's a better compromise. So definitely raising to their awareness, what are best practices, what are the challenges and costs involved to doing it in a not ideal way, and really working towards something that will work for both of you. Excellent. Well, we have just hit, I think, the 1 hour mark. Shall I go ahead and do the conclusion slide?
Sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. As you know, we started out talking about past struggles, so talking about those traditional outreach mechanisms and the limitations that existed with them. We then got into current challenges and the needs that are reflected in those challenges. And so that sort of set the stage for it's time to pivot, adapt, and flex. And so Ryan helped walk us through on what those meant in a strategic sense, and then gave us some great examples that we can go look at and help inspire some of our own activity when it comes to packaging those collections in a way that conveys value. I invite you all to connect with us if you haven't already. For myself, you can check out my website for my services. I have some courses available. Currently it's grant writing focused, but there'll be more in the new year. This video and others will be on my YouTube channel you can check out. I'm on Twitter, where you can connect with me there. And if you haven't already, if you sign up for my newsletter, you'll get invitations to events like this, where for more webinars and any other sort of resources that I come up with to help support you. Ryan?
And so I also am on some of these similar channels as well, and really invite the furtherance of this conversation. Both Rachael and I are always looking for other examples that are out there. We're always looking towards what are some of these best practices in a time where things are moving so quickly. And then also we welcome your questions. Speaking for myself, I learn a lot through hearing questions, and if I'm not sure of the answer, investigating. And so we welcome that. And in addition to the questions we answered just now, for the questions that you put in the chat, we'll make sure to try to address those as best we can and have a summary document that'll be available to all as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you will all that have registered will receive an email the next day with the link to this webinar in case you missed parts, and any other sort of resources that Ryan and I want to share with you will all be packaged in there. So you will get that the next day after viewing this recording. And with that, we would just like to thank you. And thank you, Ryan, so much for joining me on this. I really enjoyed working on this with you and digging into this very important topic.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Rachael. And it has been wonderful collaborating with you on this. Thank you.